The rain fell in steady sheets, drumming on the roof of Victoria's car as she sat in silence, gripping her phone. Her thumb hovered over the replay button. She had already watched the video 3 times, but she couldn't stop herself. The screen illuminated her face in the dim light. There was Alex, her husband of 12 years, standing in a shadowy parking lot. A man in a dark coat approached him, and after a brief exchange, Alex handed him a black envelope. He glanced around nervously, his body tense, before walking back to his car. Victoria's stomach churned as she watched. This was the same man who kissed her forehead every morning, told her he loved her before bed. The same man she thought she knew. "What are you hiding, Alex?" The video ended and the screen went black. Victoria stared at her reflection, blurred by raindrops on the windshield. She felt the first sting of tears, but she blinked them away. This wasn't the time to break down. She needed to think, to plan. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. Victoria moved through the motions of making breakfast, but her hands were unsteady, and the eggs in the pan sizzled too long, their edges burning. Alex walked into the kitchen, already dressed for work. He smelled like his expensive cologne, the one he only wore on important days. "Morning," he said casually, kissing her on the cheek. He reached for a mug and poured himself coffee, oblivious to the tension in her posture. "Morning," Victoria replied, her voice tight. She set 2 plates on the table, his with perfect golden eggs, hers untouched. Alex sat down, scrolling through his phone while taking bites of toast. The glow of the screen lit up his face, making him seem more distant than ever. "You're quiet today," he remarked, glancing up. "Just tired," Victoria said, avoiding his eyes. Alex nodded, clearly uninterested in pressing further. His phone buzzed, and he quickly turned it face down on the table. "Work?" Victoria asked, feigning casual curiosity. "Yeah," he said, his tone clipped. He checked his watch and stood up abruptly. "I've got an early meeting. I might be late tonight." "Of course," she said, trying to keep the bitterness out of her voice. Alex kissed her forehead, mechanically, without warmth, and left, the front door clicking shut behind him. Victoria stared at his empty chair, the half-eaten toast on his plate, her hand clenched around her coffee mug until her knuckles turned white. She grabbed her phone from the counter and scrolled to a saved number. The name Carter Investigations glowed on the screen. Her finger hovered over the call button for a moment before she pressed it. The phone rang twice before a deep male voice answered. "Carter." "It's me," Victoria said, her voice firm but low. "Keep following him. I need to know who he's meeting." "Understood," Carter replied. "Any new details on your end?" Victoria hesitated, glancing at the kitchen table where Alex's phone had sat moments earlier. "Not yet," she said, "but I'll find something." She ended the call and leaned against the counter, her breathing shallow. A part of her wanted to believe there was a simple explanation for Alex's behavior, but another part, the part she couldn't ignore, whispered that this was only the beginning. The day dragged on, the hours blending into one another. Victoria tried to distract herself with errands and household chores, but her mind kept replaying the video. By the time the kids came home from school, she was exhausted, though she plastered on a smile and helped them with homework. That evening, she sat on the couch, flipping through a book she wasn't reading. When Alex walked through the door, her stomach tightened. He looked tired, his tie loosened, his briefcase slung over his shoulder. "Long day?" she asked, testing the waters. Alex shrugged. "The usual, meetings, reports, nothing exciting." He dropped his briefcase near the couch and sat down beside her, his arm draped around her shoulders, but she felt the distance between them like a wall. "Anything interesting happen here?" he asked, his tone light. "Not really," Victoria replied, the lie burning on her tongue. They sat in silence, the TV flickering in front of them. Victoria glanced at Alex from the corner of her eye. He was scrolling through his phone again, his expression unreadable. She wondered what he would do if he knew she was watching him as closely as he seemed to be guarding his secrets. That night, after Alex had fallen asleep, Victoria crept out of bed and into the living room. She unlocked her phone and opened the video again. Her hands shook as she pressed play. The questions that had haunted her all day came rushing back. Who was the man? What was in the envelope? And why did Alex look so afraid? Victoria paused the video and stared at Alex's face, frozen on the screen. The man lying in their bed upstairs wasn't the same man she thought she had married. And if she wanted answers, she would have to find them herself. The heavy wooden door of Alex's office creaked open, and he stepped inside, closing it behind him with a deliberate click. He loosened his tie and tossed his briefcase onto the leather chair by the desk. The dim desk lamp cast shadows over the stack of folders, marked confidential. Alex's hand lingered over one in particular, labelled Grayson and Partners, Fraud Investigation. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Inside the folder was evidence of financial misconduct, missing funds, shell companies, names that connected to his colleagues, and perhaps even himself. His company was a house of cards, and it was teetering. "Damn it!" he muttered under his breath, flipping through the pages. His chest tightened as he saw his signature on a contract tied to a questionable transaction. He had signed it without reading the fine print, trusting the wrong people, as always. A knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. Alex tensed. No one ever came to his office after hours. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice sharp. The door opened slowly, and a man in a black coat stepped inside. His face was partially hidden by the shadow of his hat. "You're late," Alex said, his tone low and cutting. "Traffic," the man replied with a smirk. He pulled out a chair and sat down without waiting for an invitation. Alex leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "You have what I asked for?" The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. He placed it on the desk, but his hand didn't move away. "Before you take this, we need to talk about payment." "I've already paid you," Alex snapped. "And now I need more," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "This job is messier than I expected. You want me to clean it up? You're going to have to make it worth my while." Alex clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing. "How much?" The man's smirk widened. "Enough to ensure my silence." Alex didn't respond immediately. His mind raced. He had already stretched his finances to the limit, trying to cover up the mess at work, but he couldn't afford for this man to turn on him. "Fine," Alex said finally, his voice tight. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out an envelope filled with cash. He slid it across the desk. The man picked it up, weighed it in his hand and smiled. "Pleasure doing business." As he stood to leave, he paused by the door. "Oh, and Alex, you might want to keep an eye on your wife. She's been asking a lot of questions." Alex's blood ran cold. "What did you say?" The man chuckled. "You heard me. She's not as clueless as you think." Across town, Victoria stood in the middle of a dimly lit apartment. The air was stale, and the only sound was the hum of a refrigerator. She clutched a set of keys in one hand and a manila folder in the other. She had found the address scribbled on a slip of paper in Alex's jacket pocket. At first, she thought it might lead her to another office or a meeting location, but instead it brought her here, to a small, sparsely furnished apartment. Victoria placed the folder on the table and opened it cautiously. Her breath caught as she flipped through the pages. Inside were legal documents, drafts of a divorce agreement, notes on the division of assets, a list of her personal belongings. At the bottom of the pile was a typed custody agreement for their children. Victoria's hands began to shake. She stepped back from the table, her mind reeling. "He's been planning this," she thought. "All this time he's been preparing to leave us." A soft noise behind her made her freeze. She turned sharply, her heart pounding. The apartment was empty, or so she thought, but for a moment she could have sworn she heard the floor creak. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. No response. She grabbed the folder and left the apartment, locking the door behind her. As she walked to her car, she glanced over her shoulder repeatedly, the feeling of being watched crawling up her spine. That night, Victoria sat in her car outside her home, staring at the glowing windows. The folder lay on the passenger seat. Her thoughts churned. Should she confront Alex? Should she wait and gather more evidence? Her phone buzzed, breaking her trance. It was a text message from Carter. "Update. Your husband met with an associate tonight. He paid him off. We'll send photos." Victoria's chest tightened. Her hands gripped the steering wheel. So it's true, she thought bitterly. He's hiding everything from me. When she finally walked into the house, Alex was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He looked up as she entered, his face unreadable. Where were you? He asked casually. Victoria hesitated for a fraction of a second before forcing a smile. Out with a friend. Alex nodded, but his eyes lingered on her for a moment too long. Long night? He asked. You could say that, she replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. She sat down beside him, feeling the distance between them like a physical wall. As the TV droned on in the background, Victoria glanced at Alex from the corner of her eye. He seemed calm, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped against his phone. They were both hiding something, and they both knew it. Victoria paced the kitchen, her bare feet padding against the cold tile floor. The manila folder lay open on the counter, its contents spread out like evidence in a courtroom. Divorce papers, custody agreements, notes about the division of assets. Each page was a dagger to her heart. Her phone buzzed on the counter, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Carter. We need to talk. Urgent. Before she could respond, the front door creaked open. She tensed as Alex walked in, his face shadowed with exhaustion. He set his briefcase down by the door and glanced at her, his expression guarded. You're up late, he said, his voice neutral. Couldn't sleep, she replied, crossing her arms over her chest. Alex stepped into the kitchen, his eyes scanning the counter. When he saw the folder, his body stiffened. What's this? He asked, his voice low. Victoria tilted her head, her gaze piercing. You tell me. Alex reached for the papers, but she slapped her hand down on them, stopping him. Don't, she said sharply. I already know what they are. You've been planning this, haven't you? Planning to leave us, to leave me. Alex's jaw tightened. It's not what you think. Then explain it to me, Victoria snapped. Explain the late nights, the meetings with strangers, the lies. Explain the divorce papers sitting on my kitchen counter. For a moment, Alex said nothing. His eyes flicked to the folder, then back to her. Finally, he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he said quietly. Victoria's stomach churned. What does that mean? What wasn't supposed to be like this? Alex leaned against the counter, his shoulders slumping. The company's in trouble, Victoria. Serious trouble. I signed off on something I shouldn't have, and now it's coming back to haunt me. Those papers, they were a contingency plan. If things went south, I needed to make sure you and the kids would be protected. Victoria stared at him, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. You expect me to believe that? That this was all for me? It's the truth, Alex insisted. I didn't want to drag you into this. I thought if I could handle it on my own. Handle it? Victoria interrupted, her voice rising. By meeting shady men in parking lots, by hiding money and lying to my face. Alex opened his mouth to respond, but a sudden knock at the door silenced them both. They exchanged a glance, the tension in the room thickening. Are you expecting someone? Victoria asked. Alex shook his head, his expression darkening. Stay here. He moved toward the door, his steps careful and deliberate. When he opened it, a man in a dark coat stood on the porch, the same man from the video Victoria had recorded. What are you doing here? Alex demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The man stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. We need to talk, he said, his eyes flicking to Victoria. All three of us. Get out. Alex growled, his fists clenching at his sides. The man chuckled, ignoring him. You didn't think you could keep this little charade going forever, did you? She was bound to find out. Victoria stepped forward, her heart pounding. Who are you? What do you want? The man turned to her, a sly smile playing on his lips. I'm the one who's been keeping your husband's secrets, and yours too, for that matter. Her breath hitched. What are you talking about? The man reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope. He tossed it onto the counter, where it landed with a soft thud. Open it, he said. Victoria hesitated before picking it up. Inside were photos of her, of Alex, of their children. But these weren't ordinary family photos. They were surveillance shots, taken from a distance. One showed her walking into the apartment where she'd found the divorce papers. Another showed Alex handing off the black envelope. You've been following us, she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. Not just following, the man said. Guiding, pushing, making sure you both played your parts perfectly. Alex stepped in front of Victoria, his eyes blazing. What the hell is your game? The man shrugged. It's not personal, it's just business. You made a mistake and someone has to pay for it. I'm just here to make sure the fallout is profitable. Victoria's mind raced. This man had been pulling the strings, manipulating them both. Every doubt, every suspicion, it had all been orchestrated. Why us? She demanded. The man's smile widened. Because you were easy. A little nudge here, a little planted evidence there, and you both did exactly what I needed you to do. Alex lunged toward him, but the man stepped back, holding up his hands. Careful, he warned. You wouldn't want me to call my friends, would you? Alex froze, his chest heaving with anger. Get out, Victoria said, her voice steady despite the chaos inside her. Now. The man tipped his hat mockingly before turning and walking out the door. As soon as it closed, Victoria sank into a chair, her head in her hands. Alex stood frozen, staring at the door as if expecting the man to return. What do we do now? Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex looked at her, his expression grim. We find out who he's working for, and we end this. For the first time in months, they were on the same side. But the road ahead was darker than they had imagined.